is Renee Jeffery and I'm a Professor of International Relations in the Griffith Asia Institute. Over the coming weeks and months, I'll be introducing and profiling some of the amazing research that our members, colleagues and friends are conducting in Asia and the Pacific. Together we're going to be telling a series of stories that delve into our most recent research findings and uncover what motivates our researchers' work, what draws them to focus their research on the Asia Pacific, how the development of their careers has led them to become Asia researchers, and how they go about conducting research in the region. We're going to be launching and promoting a series of exciting new books and major reports that our members have published. We're going to meet some of our great PhD students, discuss our ongoing and future research projects, and talk about the everyday realities of conducting research in and about Asia. Together, we want to highlight the contributions that our researchers are making to understanding our region and find out a bit more about what it is about Asia and the Pacific that intrigues, inspires, and excites us. So for those of you who are watching or joining us live via Zoom today, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions towards the end of the session. Please use the chat function to ask questions, and remember to please keep your questions short and to the point. This new online environment that we live in really encourages us to be really direct in our formulation of questions. For those who are listening to the recording, we really hope that you enjoy the conversation. Please also feel free to join in on the conversation on Twitter via the Researching Asia Stories hashtag. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Caitlin Byrne and her story, Taking the Long Road, a research journey toward the Asia Pacific today. Caitlin is the extremely energetic director of the Griffith Asia Institute. She's also a faculty fellow at the University of Southern California's Center for Public Diplomacy. Caitlin joined Griffith University as the Director of GAI in 2017, having previously held an academic post at Bond University. Before turning to academia, however, Caitlin pursued an interesting and varied career across a range of government, business and community sectors. Her research primarily focuses on Australian diplomacy, in particular Australia's diplomatic engagement in the Asia Pacific. She has particular interests in the areas of leadership, soft power, public diplomacy, and including the roles of education, sport and culture in diplomatic engagement. So welcome, Caitlin.
Thanks, Renee. It's really great to be here and fantastic. Can I say before we even start talking, what a great initiative this is. I'm so pleased you're leading it and I hope we get to hear your story along the way too.
Well, yes, maybe. So what I'd like to do, before we talk about your current research, is talk a little bit about your career, because I think it's fair to say that your career has not followed that traditional, undergraduate to postgraduate to academic job trajectory. I think everyone will find out when they hear my story that your career story is a much more interesting one than mine.
I know.
So your first degree was in law.
Yes.
And when you finished, you went and got a job with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So what made you apply to DFAT?
Well, it's funny, Renee. I think the two words that I think of when I think about my career, two words that immediately come to mind are accidental and eclectic. And maybe that goes towards this theme of taking the long road. I think, my trajectory has never been a linear one, and it's never always been clear to me either where I'm heading. But actually, I studied law, and when I studied law, I did an international relations major in my law degree, and I was in a really interesting position where I was not very good at the law subjects, but I was really good at the international relations subjects. So I knew I never actually wanted to practice law, but that somehow I wanted to work in an international space and that kind of domain. And actually, before joining DFAT, I had a really fantastic opportunity to work for Senator Claiborne Pell, who was a Democrat in the US Senate, a Democrat from Rhode Island. And I went in and worked in his office in the Capitol. And at that time, he was the Foreign Relations chairperson, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairperson. So I had this really amazing experience working in Washington, DC. I mean, don't get me wrong, I did a lot of envelope stuffing. I folded a lot of letters. I did a little bit of research on constituent issues, but it was just being in the environment where people are making decisions about policy. And at that stage, you know, we're talking very early 90s, about America's position in the world. And I think that experience, you know, led me to then apply to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade as a lawyer, where I worked in international law and learned an enormous amount working across a treaties area, international humanitarian law, as well as domestic and admin law as it applies to diplomats in Australia. So that's really where it all began.
Wow, okay. So you start a job at DFAT and you spend several years there, and then you took a posting to Mexico. Now, that's not an obvious choice.
No.
What drove that? Was that one of those ones where they've said, look, here are your options, and you thought, well, of the options they've given me, okay, that's probably the most palatable one? Or was there something that actually made you think, I really want to go and work in the embassy in Mexico?
Well, no. And this is the brilliant thing, you know, I know so many of our students, particularly in the international relations and political science area, so many students are keen to join DFAT, and I totally endorse it in terms of career options. For people like me who probably thrive on change and love a range of options, it's a really great career because you get a lot of different options. So I'd been in the legal office for a couple of years. The posting round came out and you can apply for a number of different and rank your different choices. My first choice was actually Cambodia. I think my first 4 choices were all in Southeast Asia, and Mexico was actually number 5. I ended up with my 5th option, and newly married, my husband and I toddled off to Mexico City. Actually looking back, you know, spending time in Mexico was actually probably ultimately quite a good primer for coming back and spending more time in our region. It has a wonderful kind of vibrancy to the culture. It's really diverse. The people are just so incredibly generous and hospitable, but it's not without its challenges at every level. So we spent a couple of years in Mexico. Absolutely loved it. And a real highlight actually in the career.
Mm-hmm. So then what prompted you to take a more academic route from that point? So you had this really exciting opportunity and being able to be sort of, you know, out there in the world, but then you decided to do a PhD. So what was the driving force behind that decision?
Well, it actually came much later. So between Mexico, I spent time here in Brisbane with the Queensland Passports Office. I ran that for a few years. I then went into the private sector. Honestly, I did not think, I thought academia was as far away from anything I could do. One of the things I learned through the experience in Mexico, I was the consul in the embassy there. I seemed to be pretty good at solving problems on the ground, and we had a lot of consular issues that required us to think really creatively and be very practical and think on our feet. Whether it was dealing with people who had been detained or were in jail unexpectedly. We did have some really sad cases of people dying through their travels and having to find ways of bringing them back to Australia. So these were all really practical things. So I certainly didn't anticipate ever going into academia. It was some years later, after our 4th baby, and maybe I was just used to spending time being up late at night, and our 4th child was sleeping through, and I was still getting up and looking for things to do. So research became, research suddenly was interesting to me, and I had a bit of time to start thinking about it. I actually started my PhD when we were living in rural Australia, in a little town outside Mildura, for anyone who is familiar with northwestern Victoria. And it was at the time when the Australian Senate had just started an inquiry into the nature and conduct of Australia's public diplomacy. This was really interesting to me because as a diplomat, we hadn't really we hadn't really deeply engaged in the idea or the concept or the practice of public diplomacy. And in so many ways, it relates to the way that Australia presents itself. Firstly, conceives of itself and then represents itself to the rest of the world. And so I was really fascinated to see how this development, how these conversations around public diplomacy might actually inform practice.
Wow. And so was it just a natural connection to focus then primarily on the Asia Pacific when you started to do that research, to go back to what you'd originally sort of wanted to do as a diplomat?
Yeah, I think it became apparent to me actually through my early dealings with the Griffith Asia Institute. So when I was starting, I actually started my PhD, but at the same time I had a full-time job. I was back in Queensland implementing new adoption laws for Queensland state government. And my husband was at home with our 4 kids. The youngest was in kindy. And he said to me, if you want to do your PhD, now's the time, because he was really focused on the kids. And so I guess at that stage, I threw myself between work and the PhD, and an opportunity came up through the Griffith Asia Institute to travel to China as part of the Asia. At that stage, it was the Emerging Leaders Dialogue. It's now our Asia Future Fellows Dialogue. And I went to China for the first time at the age of 38 in 2009. I had never thought, you know, I'd really thought, because I'd spent time in Europe, the US, Mexico, I had missed that opportunity, you know, that seemed to come for many people to develop their Asia expertise. And in some ways, and I think this was I've had a light bulb moment since this. I thought, you know, you had to be a specialist in Asian studies or language to really engage in Asia. And it was the trip that I took through Griffith Asia Institute to China, 2009, that totally turned my thinking around, and actually really set me on a very different trajectory into academia. And so I went into teaching diplomacy initially at Bond, but also in Asia. And I took any opportunity I could to spend time in the region.
Wow, that's fascinating. Just how it's sort of, you know, fortuitous it's been, you know, being invited to go along with something, and how those sorts of really sort of lucky coincidences can really shape how a career goes. So in terms of conducting your research, I'm really, really interested in how your sort of past and present professional experience shapes how you do research in the region. Look, it seems to me that you have this really interesting overlap going on between sort of being a researcher and a practitioner, and that's sort of a past and present thing. You studied diplomacy, but you've also worked for DFAT. We know that your current role has a huge amount of Asian engagement. As part of it, that you amass a gazillion frequent flyer points traveling all over the region, building, you know, person-to-person relationships, promoting education, doing quite a lot of actual diplomatic work. So in a sense, you're talking to people about diplomacy, you're doing public diplomacy, and you're researching it all at the same time. So what I'm really interested in knowing is, how does that intersection between professional practice and research inform how you go about researching these sorts of topics?
I don't know, I've got a great answer for this, and because I think I'm still working that out in a way, but I am really interested and have discovered how interested I am in that, you know, that nexus between theoretical knowledge and practice. And I guess underpinning that is an interest in the way that individuals experience the world. So I think that's probably been at the core of how I've started to shape my own research methods. And, you know, I do consider myself to be more a practitioner than a researcher. And what I love about being part of the Institute is we have such great researchers who can pull me up on the method side of things. And I learn so much from having that opportunity to talk with people. I think ultimately I am really interested in narratives and a kind of narrative inquiry approach. So really understanding through individual and collective stories how people experience the world, how their practice might be informed by their experiences of the world, And then how do we translate that to either inform broader policy or systemic frameworks, or reveal the vulnerabilities in them? So I think at the end of the day, and I think this is always a tricky thing for academics, and again, I'd be really interested in the stories that come through this series. I think there's always a challenge in finding your groove, your research groove, and then finding your voice. And I think for me, it's been around narrative and bringing a diversity of voice into my voice.
So is that in part been about the fact that you get to go to so many places and you spend so much time talking to such a huge range of people from across the region, and about then having this sort of interwoven set of stories about how people understand themselves and how they interact and that sort of thing? So it's very much sort of driven by the fact that you have these opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Going back to my misperception that for some reason Asia was off limits to me because I didn't have that expertise, I think that's a real lesson that I'd like to kind of share with other people, that it is so accessible, and it's really by understanding stories. And I probably also had this moment living in Mildura. I spent a fair bit of time working in community development, and one of the projects we worked on was building an early learning centre for a vulnerable community, and we were working really closely with a primary school, Mildura Primary School, that has a very high Indigenous enrolment rate, and we're working really closely with Indigenous families. And one of the real key to the success of this particular project was when we were able to tap into the stories that gave meaning to this community. So, we often think or my experience with my kids was relying on very traditional fairy tales and riddles and things like that. What we found worked in this space was getting the stories of the region, collecting emu eggs from along the banks of the Murray River, for example. Oh, your screen's falling. My banner's still up. I hope you can see that. Oh, well done. I love the screen idea though, Renee. My kids are still traumatized. Well, not traumatized, but my kids are all coming in and saying, why do we have Griffith Asia Institute in our house? But just going back to this idea of stories is, I think, what actually, it means that I don't go into anything in the region with a presupposed idea of how people live and experience their world. But we can actually find that out, and we can make that accessible to others.
Yeah, okay. I mean, look, that provides us with a really, really interesting link to the current research that you've been engaging in, that's been looking at the role of the arts and cultural sectors in leadership in the Asia Pacific. And I know that you've been taking that narrative approach in looking at the development of leadership in that area, and what we can learn from leadership in culture and the arts sort of more broadly. And I think that's an absolutely fascinating project. How did that come about? How did you start doing that? Other than, I mean, there are lots of obvious, easy answers to say, why wouldn't you, if you're travelling around Asia, want to be engaged in art and culture? But what drove the specific research part of this project?
Well, it actually came out of a collaboration with a colleague, Ruth Berrison, also from Griffith. And Ruth and I, have Ruth sits in the arts space, really in cultural policy, and me on the diplomacy side. And we've been having these very, robust conversations about the role of culture in the way that nations engage with each other. And we also were having a conversation with the Asia Europe Foundation based in Singapore, and a project came forward to do some cultural mapping of Southeast Asia to align with ASEAN's 50th anniversary. And Ruth and I thought that would be a really interesting project, and we started talking with participants from each of the 10 member states of ASEAN. We had arts practitioners identified across Southeast Asia, and we began with a workshop. Would you believe, in Malta on the sidelines of the World Summit of Arts and Culture. It was a couple of years ago now. And through this workshop, we got people to talk about their own journey as an arts practitioner in their community, in their sector, in their nation, and within this regional ASEAN architecture. And what we discovered was that this was not going to be a traditional mapping exercise. You know, you can't, and I think Megan Dargle talks about this in a beautiful paper she's done on narrative in international relations, where people's stories, we sometimes lose the vibrancy of their backstories, of their narratives, when we try and pin data on points like a graph. So we decided that we wanted to really unravel through collecting their individual narratives over a period of time. And we worked with these participants over a couple of years, both meeting up with them. We'd hold workshops within the region, and they also came to Brisbane to collect their individual stories as arts practitioners, and then to try and understand what that collective narrative was telling us about arts practice in the region. And we do have a lot to learn from arts practitioners in terms of leadership and in the way that the arts offers us a vehicle to give and gain meaning from our world. But we also identified some points of deficiency where arts practitioners themselves you know, sometimes are removed from the table. They're not at the decision-making tables, for example. So bringing arts much more closely into our policy framework and our decision-making frameworks might have some benefit for leadership more broadly.
Wow. I've had the benefit of reading a draft of that, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And I think there are also some really interesting sort of broader themes that you bring out in that piece. And one of them that's really grabbed my attention is something that I've been thinking about and writing about for quite some time. And that's this idea of what a tradition might be. And in the piece, you talk about this tension that exists on the one hand between, you know, the old sort of past cultural and artistic traditions and the real need there is to preserve and respect those traditions as part of cultures and identities and so on. But on the other hand, this idea that, like all traditions, cultural and artistic traditions in the region are, you know, they're evolving. They're not static. Yeah. These are things that are responding to what's going on around them. They're responding to all sorts of, you know, different pressures and commenting on contemporary life. And so you've got that tension between preservation and innovation. And it's almost a metaphor for so many things that we look at when we study Asia and the Pacific. And so what I'm really keen to know is in this dynamic, how do you see this playing out in terms of leadership? How does that old, new, you know, preservation, innovation set of relationships work?
Oh, it's so interesting. And what I found fascinating through these narratives was with our participants, they hadn't met before. They hadn't actually spent a great deal of time travelling to each other's nations. They were very well-educated, well-informed, fabulously travelled people, having spent time in New York, in Rio, in Paris, you know, on different forms of scholarships, and yet had never really spent time in each other's nations within Southeast Asia. So having them explore some of these themes around the table was fascinating to watch their own reactions to each other, and this idea of the tension that sits between tradition and preservation and innovation was a really common tension. So our hip hop dancer from Laos, you know, I mean, he was pushing the boundaries of innovation and really determined that Laos should be seen, for example, in some of the major ASEAN, Southeast Asian hip hop competitions.
Yeah.
But that was creating some tensions for him at home as well. A Cambodian participant also, you know, focused on dance, for example, and Cambodia in particular, where there's a real sensitivity to the preservation of history and tradition and culture in the arts. having, for him, having to speak to audiences in his community, older, you know, his parents' generation, about the importance of moving forward. And this is where I think the arts presents a really important vehicle, because it allows us to find ways of representing tradition and representing the past in the present in ways that enables innovation. So it's not dismissing, it's not cutting it off, but it's actually finding ways to pull it forward as well. And it goes into that idea of, you know, in so many traditions in our part of the world, time is circular. That linear trajectory doesn't really exist, and past, present and future exist in the same moment.
Great. Look, I'm going to remind everybody who's listening live that we have the chat function open, and that if you have any questions for Caitlin, to please post them on there, because I can start opening the floor for questions in a moment. But while people are thinking and typing away, I'd just like to finish by asking you, what's next? What's the next great sort of your research puzzle or topic that you're thinking of attacking in the region?
Really interested in spending more time in Southeast Asia, and you did mention travel before. The past couple of months, what I have to say is how great it's been for us to really become adept at using technology. And I've actually really loved being at home and spending time with the family and knowing what's in the kitchen cupboard, which often, my previous travel schedule meant that I was so out of the loop with the shopping and what was going on at home. And I feel like that's been really good to come back to. But, I feel the pull of getting back into Southeast Asia and connecting with people and really understanding. I mean, I think one of the things we've been talking about quite a bit at Griffith is the importance of listening, and listening to, oh, there goes the screen again. I love live streaming.
Don't worry, somebody next door will get out a jackhammer in a minute and we'll be great.
The dog will start here as well, don't worry. So I'm really looking forward to I think we still need to understand more about how the region sees us and how Australia, we continue to talk about how important the Asia-Pacific region or the Indo-Pacific region is for us. I'd like to spend more time listening to how the region sees us and sees the kind of contribution that Australian diplomacy, traditional and public, can make to the way we as a region kind of face up to some of the big challenges ahead.
So I've got a really interesting question here from Tess Newton-Kane. So she's asking, where are the strengths and weaknesses in Australia's offering when it comes to sharing cultural and narratives as part of our diplomatic engagement in Southeast Asia?
Oh,
yeah.
What a big question, Tess. And I can't see you, but so great that you're here in the background. And I know this is something, that you've been thinking about, particularly with the Pacific. So it's a really important question, not just for Southeast Asia, but also about Australia's engagement in the Pacific. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is how much Australia has changed over the last couple of decades, and how I don't know if we represent the diversity of us today to the rest of the world all that well. I think sometimes we still fall back on familiar tropes and stereotypes ourselves. I think there's a huge opportunity for artistic and cultural collaboration and exchange. And of course, Australia's Indigenous cultures and heritage are absolutely of interest around the world. And they do form a significant part of Australia's cultural diplomacy. I'd really love to see us as a nation absolutely value that and place a greater recognition on the importance of Indigenous cultures, voices, I think, and this is probably a point I've been rabbiting on about on Twitter with my hashtag soft power for a while, but ultimately, the way I see soft power and Australia's potential soft power is that it starts at home, and it's all about the way we understand ourselves and we interact with each other at home and in the region. And I think we can do a better job on that.
So Elise is asking, what's the future of public diplomacy for the region? Has the requirement to go digital change things for diplomacy and public diplomacy in the future, do you think?
Nice question, Elise. I think this is something we need to be writing about. Yeah, look, it's again a really big question. I think in this region, as we go into the digital sphere, one of the real challenges for public diplomacy is making sure we maintain the relational aspect of it, that we don't fall back on broadcast, you know, the Cold War models of public diplomacy that were much more aligned to propaganda and information push rather than kind of two-way dialogue or collaboration, where we come into a conversation open to others' perspectives rather than coming into a conversation with our own, you know, set way of seeing the world. So I think the digital dimension potentially creates some challenges for us, and also, you know, against a background of increasing misinformation, disinformation, fake news. The core of successful public diplomacy or diplomatic engagement with people today really rests on authenticity and credibility and an opportunity for dialogue. So they're the kind of things we have to make sure we don't lose.
Well, on that note, I think that is a fantastic sort of message, if you like, if we weren't planning to get to a message, but in fitting with the idea of a long road and an unexpected journey to a particular end, I think that is a fantastic way to end our seminar today. So I'd really like to thank everybody who has joined us online. There's a whole lot of links and a really nice conversation going on in the chat function. If you didn't want to pose a question to be answered live, certainly continue to chat using that function and follow the links. People have put some great suggestions of articles and so on up there, which is fantastic to see. But most of all, of course, I'd really like to thank you, Caitlin, for your time today and for telling us this really fascinating story of how you've come to be you know, an Asia researcher, how you've come to be the director of the Griffith Asia Institute, and to sort of demonstrate to everybody that the direct road, the standard path is not the only way of getting to where you are, that there are all sorts of twists and turns, and that in many ways this makes for a much more sort of colourful and engaged career. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Renee. Great to talk to you. And thanks for, again, thank you for thinking of this and putting these stories out there. It's fabulous.
No problem. And we'll see everybody next week. Next week, we're going to be talking to Dr. Emma Palmer and launching her new book on international criminal law in Southeast Asia, which is really exciting. The release date of that internationally has been moved forward a bit, so we will be launching it for her online and through the podcast. So we'll see you all next week. Thanks.
Fantastic.
Bye.
Thank you. See you.
Bye.